consider the lobster. It features in the menus of expensive Michelin-star restaurants and conjures up images of flowing wine, celebration, and indulgence. What many don't know is that just a few hundred years ago, the lobster was once dismissed as the poor man's chicken and even the cockroach of the sea. Looked upon with scorn, it was used mostly as bait, fertilizer, and prison food. So, how exactly did the lobster go from disdained prison food to fine dining delicacy?
It might not seem like it, but there's a lot to learn from the history of this crustacean. The story of the lobster is also the story of how culture shapes our palate and how we could start to get a taste for foods that do less damage to the atmosphere.
In this episode, we take these lessons from the lobster and we think to the future. We imagine what it would look like to live in a world less centered around traditional meat production and think through how our food systems might change in the process. From the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, I'm Heewon Park.
And I'm Noah Gordon.
And you're listening to Barbecue Earth.
Episode 5. Consider the lobster.
When pilgrims first arrived in the New England bays in the 1600s, the ocean was teeming with lobster. Because it was so easily accessible, lobster was extremely cheap. It was considered a lowly, poor man's food. In fact, it was considered so contemptible that laws were eventually put in place to stop the, quote, cruel and unusual, end quote, act of serving too much lobster to incarcerated people. Then, fast forward to the 1800s, when the invention of canned food and railroads transformed our relationship to the lobster. Here's Melanie Joy, social psychologist and founder of the nonprofit Beyond Carnism.
Lobster started to be used for soldiers and shipped across the country. And then people started having access to it. I think it was coming from Maine. People in California started having access to cooked lobsters. And through trying this food, recognized that it was actually tasty.
By the 1880s, the supply of lobster had diminished significantly, while American demand for it was only increasing.
The cost of lobster, therefore, went up, making it less accessible to people with less money and only accessible to people with more money.
Today, lobster is seen as a rich man's food, a gourmet meal that you might treat yourself to only on a very special occasion.
I think what this story illustrates is that there isn't a lot of rationality around which animals we do and don't eat. Historically, people have eaten animals that have been geographically available.
In other words, there's nothing innate or fixed about why humans choose to eat some animals over others. Our perception of food is emotional, cultural, and sometimes even religious. For example, think of how millions of Hindus abstain from beef. Our relationship to food is not objective or static.
Imagine that you are biting into a juicy hamburger. Your dining companion turns to you and says that the hamburger is actually not made from beef, it's made from golden retrievers. Chances are what you thought of just moments ago as food, you now think of as dead animals. And what you just had felt was delicious, you now feel is disgusting. And therefore, rather than continue to eat the hamburger, you probably want to throw it in the trash and maybe even take to the streets in protest.
What are these invisible forces that make us salivate at the thought of, say, beef, but repulsed by the idea of dogs as food? In order to explain these normative structures, Joy coined the term carnism.
Carnism is the invisible belief system or ideology that conditions us to eat certain animals. Carnism teaches us to justify eating animals by teaching us to believe that the myths of eating animals are the facts of eating animals. These myths fall under what I refer to as the 3 N's of justification. Eating animals is normal, natural, and necessary. Because carnism is institutionalized, it's embraced and maintained by all of our major institutions, from the family to the state.
Carnism isn't unique to Americans. It's present all over the world.
Members of all cultures have been conditioned to perceive a select handful of animals as edible. All the rest they perceive as inedible and usually disgusting to consume and often even morally offensive.
Of course, the specific iterations of carnistic ideologies vary by country and culture. Liz Specht, the Senior Vice President for Science and Technology at the Good Food Institute, explains.
I think our binning of certain animals into food versus companion versus recreational is really quite cultural and quite variable.
And in the context of the United States,
why are we basically eating 5 or 6 of them, right? We eat chickens, cows, pigs. There's not a whole lot else. And that's really an artifact of the fact that those animals lived near humans at the time that we were moving into agricultural production and happened to be pretty easy to domesticate. It's not at all a reflection of those being the most nutritious or having the most delicious meat or anything like that.
In contrast, these same bacon and steak-eating Americans might recoil at the thought of eating the snails common in French cuisine, the chicken's feet found throughout Asia, or the grasshoppers frequently sold as street food in Oaxaca, Mexico. Culture is powerful. Carnism and all the feelings it causes us to have about animals and food are strong. These same feelings make us reticent to any changes in the status quo of our food systems. But our current model of food consumption simply isn't working. Here's Noah Gordon, co-director of the Sustainability, Climate, and Geopolitics program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace.
Food systems account for approximately 1/3 of global greenhouse gas emissions, and animal agriculture is by far the most polluting and most water-intensive of all types of agriculture. In the US, we grow cow food in Arizona deserts where we don't even have enough fresh water to build new homes.
So, how could our food systems become more sustainable? One path forward is something called regenerative agriculture. Regenerative agriculture involves practices that originated in indigenous communities and prioritizes improving the health of the land and ecosystem. Here's Penelope Brees, a regenerative farmer from Longview Farm in Maryland.
It's all about building the soil, harvesting the sun. It's about making this land better than it was.
Regenerative farmers improve soil health by building up carbon. This practice helps farmers by improving crop production and preventing soil erosion. And it also helps the environment, since more carbon in the ground means less in our atmosphere. At Longview Farm, Penelope Brees works to improve soil through something often referred to as rotational grazing. This means that her cows graze just one section of a field at a time and are moved to new pastures frequently.
So every day I move them. This purpose is that it moves the water, it moves their manure around. They're not all congregating under the shade and leaving manure just in one spot. And it allows the grass to rest for 60 days and then to regrow. Now, if I was a conventional farmer, I would put all these cows and more in this big field and move them in 30 days. And all their manure would be concentrated in one area, around where the shade was and around where the water was.
Practices like this help reduce farms' carbon emissions. But there are limits to how, quote-unquote, climate-friendly a state can be. You might remember from the 2000s the mirage of, quote-unquote, clean coal. Specht says that we have another path towards more fundamental change: alternative proteins.
Alternative proteins is really a term that describes products that are drop-in replacements for conventional meat proteins. Meat, dairy, and egg proteins fall within that category.
Specht says that these alternative proteins are vastly more environmentally efficient forms of food than traditional meat. Just consider beef, for example. It takes over 30 calories of feed just to produce 1 calorie of beef, whereas alternative proteins avoid all the resource cost of feeding and raising animals for consumption.
We're not taking calories from feed crops or from grazing and channeling them through a living, breathing, metabolizing animal. They're being turned directly into end products for consumers. Just from a thermodynamic perspective, that efficiency is far higher.
One reason alternative proteins can be good for the climate is that they use less land. Humans use about 3/4 of all global farmland for livestock, either for grazing or growing animal feed. It's pretty unrealistic to think that we'll replace all traditional meat with alternative proteins. But Gordon says that even a small amount of displacement would still have massive benefits for the environment.
One study from Boston Consulting Group found that if alternative proteins rose to take up just 10% of the market, the carbon savings would be equivalent to decarbonizing nearly the entire aviation industry.
Specht says there are 3 main categories of alternative proteins. 1, plant-based proteins. 2, microbial fermentation. And 3, lab-cultivated meats. Let's start with plant-based.
So for plant-based, you're just using plant-derived ingredients. That includes proteins, but of course there's other things in protein products, right? There's fats, there's flavorings, there's vitamins, etc. So using plant-sourced versions of all of those components and then assembling a product that has taste, texture, nutritional qualities that consumers expect from a meat product.
Think of the veggie burger made of various bean products, or the Impossible Whopper at Burger King. Sometimes, these plant-based proteins get a bad rap in pop culture for pretending to be something that they're not, or for trying to resemble meat and dairy but failing to deliver the flavor that we might expect. Microbial fermentation presents a second alternative. SPECT and Carnegie Endowment Senior Fellow John Bateman explain.
For microbial fermentation, there's a couple of different sort of subcategories within that. So one is using that whole cell biomass from microbes, which could be fungi, could be bacteria. Another way of using fermentation is to do what's called precision fermentation, where you're using those microorganisms essentially as tiny host cell factories to produce specific high-value ingredients. So these could be ingredients for nutritional quality. For example, you can use fermentation to make omega-3 fatty acids and put those into an alternative seafood product. Or they could be for flavoring compounds or functional proteins.
The other thing to remember about these different styles of alternative proteins is there are hybrid approaches that combine more than one. So, for example, the Impossible Burger, which you can get at every Burger King today, includes an ingredient called heme, which helps give it the kind of juicy, almost bloody, spongy, meat-like texture. That is a fermented ingredient that is added to the plant material inside that burger.
There's still a lot of innovation happening in the realm of fermented proteins today, but a lot of these products might already be pretty familiar to consumers. Here's Bateman again.
As far as fermented proteins, consumers can find some of these on the shelves today. There's a long-lasting brand called Corn, which uses fermentation technology to create meat substitutes. Beyond meat itself, fermented cashew cheese has become one of the most popular cheese alternatives that exist today, and probably the best simulation of conventional cheese that exists.
But perhaps the most interesting and up-and-coming alternative protein is the third and final category, cultivated meat. This is meat that's grown from stem cells in a lab, and it triggers all sorts of responses. We spoke to some people at a farmer's market in Washington, D.C.'s DuPont Circle, and some of them were really excited about the idea.
I'm Scott, 35 years old, live in Washington, D.C. for a number of years, work in the environmental field.
So would you eat lab-grown meat if it
were
accessible? Yeah.
I can't wait.
Of course, others were more hesitant about lab-grown meat, even if they were still open to the idea. Here's 24-year-old Lisa in D.C. and 65-year-old physician Rolf in North Carolina.
I'd be nervous about it, but I'd also be really excited because I get really sad about factory farms and I really care about animals, so I feel like I'd give it a go.
I think I would want to find out more how it compares to quality of protein, macronutrients. Is there anything that's health benefits or health detriments? Then that would be the consideration that I would be questioning.
But many others are far more skeptical. In Petersburg, Virginia, we spoke with Bree and Eunice, two 23-year-olds from Georgia and Virginia who are now working as cooks in the military. We asked them if they would ever try lab-grown meat.
We really want to push towards more healthy options and everything, so being with the lab-made meat, that's a little scary. It's weird. I would not try that.
I just feel like it sounds really weird, and I wouldn't want to do that either.
Linda Smith from North Carolina agrees with Bree and Eunice, too.
Have you heard about lab-grown meat before?
Yes, and I don't want it. Why would I want to eat meat that's grown in a lab? It's not real meat. Just like these Impossible Burgers and all this stuff. It can't be good for you. What is it made from?
A lot of the suspicion of lab-cultivated meat seems to come from the mystery of it all. What exactly is it? And how exactly is it grown in a lab? Is it real meat or some strange Frankenstein-y substance? SPECT explains.
The first step to producing cultivated meat is to get your starting cell isolate. So these cells do come from actual animals. You can take them from a fertilized egg. You can take it from a biopsy from an adult animal. There's a lot of ways that you can get that initial cell isolate. And then those cells are characterized and refined into what's called a working cell bank.
Once this cell bank is ready to go, then it's time to grow the meat, just like we do with the animals we keep in cages. This process has a few different phases to it.
First phase, you're just expanding the number of cells that you have. Again, this is what cells evolved to do, is to reproduce and divide. So you're tapping into those exact same biological mechanisms.
So how do you get these cells to expand? Well, you feed them. The cells receive a cell culture medium, which is basically just all the nutrients that any animal needs to build muscle tissue, like salts, sugars, amino acids, etc. Then the cells, quote-unquote, eat this feed and reproduce over and over again.
And then depending what type of product a cultivated meat company is making, they might have a second stage to the process where they're seeding those cells onto a matrix called a scaffold, providing kind of that structure for the tissue. So these are typically spongy, porous scaffold materials that the cells stick onto and then start to differentiate into fully mature muscle cells and fat cells.
This scaffold basically helps the reproducing cells to form some sort of structure, so it's not just a cell paste or ground meat product. For example, you might use scaffolding to cultivate chicken cells into growing a tasty thigh, without wasting energy on making a brain that can suffer. And this isn't science fiction. Cultivated, or lab-grown meat, has been around since as early as 2013. But was this first lab-grown burger everything that environmentalists had hoped for? That's coming up next, after this short break.
Hi, I'm Ravi Agrawal, host of Foreign Policy Live. Each week, I sit down with world leaders and policy experts on the issues that matter most to you. People like Greek Prime Minister Kyriakos Mitsotakis, USAID's Samantha Power, and the former Israeli Prime Minister and Defense Minister Ehud Barak. Whether it's the US-China relationship, the Israel-Hamas war, or the Global South's growing clout, Foreign Policy Live is your weekly fix for smart thinking about the world. Listen and follow us on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.
About a decade ago, Dutch pharmacologist Mark Post produced humanity's first morsel of lab-grown meat. It was a burger created from 3 months of lab work and 20,000 muscle fibers from cow stem cells. Food writers who tried this first cultivated burger said that it tasted like meat and had the quote-unquote mouthfeel of a conventional burger, although it did have less fat than one might have expected. Still, the biggest issue with this first 2013 burger wasn't necessarily the taste or the texture, but rather the cost.
It's not yet cheap or created easily. It has cost £250,000 to make and 5 years of research and production up until this day.
Of course, no one would actually pay hundreds of thousands for a burger. Since 2013, companies and investors all around the world have raced to improve upon this technology. Now, lab-grown meat's production costs have been reduced by 99%, and it's becoming more available. Noah Gordon explains.
In 2020, Singapore approved cultivated chicken for public sale. Israeli firms are starting to produce it as well.
And since June of 2023, you can order lab-grown meat in the US too.
But you can't just go to a grocery store to buy it in the US. For now, it's only sold for consumption in a few restaurants, for example, China Chircano in DC, which is run by the famous chef Jose Andres.
As you might guess from the fancy restaurants selling this lab-grown meat, the price point of cultivated meat still remains a challenge. And this is true for other forms of alternative proteins, too.
According to a report from the Good Food Institute, buying plant-based meats at the grocery store is, on average, 67% more expensive than buying animal meat.
And price isn't the only roadblock. As exciting as alternative proteins might be for their environmental implications, Gordon says they face several other barriers to wide adoption.
Another obvious challenge is taste. Of course, there are lots of plant-based proteins like tofu that are naturally plant-based, rather than being an imitation of meat or dairy. But many alternative proteins like Beyond Burgers face the daunting task of convincing customers that these plant-based hamburgers or nuggets can rival the taste of animal meat.
This is no easy feat. Alternative meat products have gotten a lot better over the years, but for many, they're still simply not good enough. And even if alternative proteins improved in taste and price, they would face one last hurdle: culture. Here's John Bateman.
Food and culture are so intertwined, and I think we need to be realistic that in the short term, merely achieving price and taste competitiveness might not be enough to drive very widespread consumer adoption because people have a lot of cultural affinities to the foods that they've grown up with. There can be an association with family heritage, like a Southern barbecue or a turkey at Thanksgiving. The development of meat itself is a deeply culturally ingrained practice. You think about cattle ranchers who are pretty close to what Americans have treasured as this cherished image of the cowboy, the cattle rustler. I mean, how many times have you seen an image of that in old Westerns, in Marlboro ads? It's deeply culturally ingrained.
For a lot of people, this traditional aspect of meat would be difficult to give up. And even for people who don't have particularly strong emotional attachments to meat, other cultural aspects frequently push people toward animal consumption. Bateman and Melanie Joy explain.
In many cultures, including the United States, there's a strong association between meat eating and masculinity.
There's still this protein myth that seems to be all pervasive, this idea that we have to eat animals' muscles to grow our own muscles.
This link between meat and masculinity is particularly prevalent in the far right. In recent years, the term soy boy has become a more popular online pejorative used to refer to men deemed not masculine enough. Here's a clip from the show The Joe Rogan Experience.
People get mad at soy. Soy is like a political fruit or a vegetable.
Is it?
Yeah. People call you a soy boy. If you're a Republican, people call weak men soy boys. That's like it's an insult.
I never knew that.
Soy is one of the rare foods that's actually attached to being a
Beyond linking soy with emasculation, conservatives have even accused climate-conscious progressives of bringing communism into American kitchens.
They want to rebuild your home. They want to take away your hamburgers. This is what Stalin dreamt about, but never achieved.
That was former Trump advisor Sebastian Gorka. But according to Bateman, the left also has its own reservations about alternative proteins.
I've talked to several left-leaning people who feel that there's a certain kind of ick factor around the idea of eating something that has been created in a lab, for example. Or they wonder about the health of, so-called frankenfoods versus what they perceive to be, quote-unquote, natural foods that come from animals. Although the way that meat is created today bears absolutely no recognizable connection to what we would think of as the natural conditions of these animals.
Alternative proteins don't have an easy road ahead. They face taste, economic, and cultural hurdles. But Bateman thinks they offer us a more humane, more efficient, and more environmentally friendly option.
I think what I would say on the optimistic side is that culture can be changed, has changed, does change, and will change. Factory farming itself is a very modern invention. It's really dates to the 1950s and since. I think we just have to remember that once the ingredients are in place, so to speak, culture has a way of adapting. If you walk into a future grocery store and you see on the shelf one slab of meat that has been grown in a lab that may seem like something your parents wouldn't have eaten, but also is just as nutritious, tasty, and chemically identical as a conventional meat, and then you see that other slab of meat that costs the same, tastes the same, but is associated with untold suffering and ecological destruction, as well as human exploitation in places like slaughterhouses. I find it very difficult to imagine that large numbers of people generations from now are going to consciously choose that second slab of meat.
The widespread success of alternative proteins is by no means guaranteed, but it's certainly possible. After all, solar power was once a far-fetched idea. Specht thinks governments around the world should be doing more to help make the alternative protein future a reality.
We're starting to see governments invest in the alternative protein sector, and that's actually ramped up quite a bit in the last year or so. So just looking back at 2022, we're now at over $1 billion globally that governments have put into alternative proteins. That might sound like a big number. It is a total drop in the bucket relative to what's needed here.
Admittedly, some governments are taking measures that may reduce traditional meat consumption. We covered in previous episodes the crackdown on farm emissions in the Netherlands. New Zealand is implementing a methane tax, and California has new rules forbidding pigs from being packed so closely together. But still, Gordon and Bateman say these are baby steps.
A recent study found that European and US governments spend more than 1,000 times as much subsidizing livestock farming as they do on alternative proteins. It's reminiscent of how governments still spend hundreds of billions on direct fossil fuel subsidies in a climate crisis largely caused by fossil fuels.
The US government has not really intentionally sought to nurture the alternative protein sector in any substantial way. There have been small investments here and there from the US Department of Agriculture, DARPA, other parts of the US government that fund important research and development efforts. But if you add up the dollar value, it's pretty small compared to what other countries are putting into this, and quite small compared to what the private sector is putting into these sectors.
But Bateman believes this should change. He says alternative proteins aren't just critical for combating climate change, but also for something perhaps more unexpected: national security. Coming up next in episode 6, why alternative proteins are important for national security, and who might emerge as winners and losers in a global protein transition. From the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, I'm Heewon Park.
And I'm Noah Gordon.
And you've been listening to Barbecue Earth. This episode was written by Noah Gordon and me, Heewon Park, and produced by me with assistance from Emily Hardy, Daniel Helmessy, Tim Martin, and Zachary Mills. Music was composed by me and artists on Artlist. Thank you to Emily Hardy and Daniel Helmessy for research support, Ryan DeVries for fact-checking, and Amy Mellon, Jocelyn Solly, and Amanda Branham for their graphic design work.
You have been listening to an audio production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Views expressed are those of the host and guest panelists and not necessarily those of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Subscribe to Carnegie podcasts on popular podcast platforms such as iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Learn more at carnegieendowment.org.